But today we look at Numbers, and we're looking at a character by the name of Balaam, who was a pagan prophet, but had a message here in the book of Numbers. Now, if you remember the story of Balaam, probably the most familiar thing we remember about Balaam is that God told him, don't go and curse the people of Israel. And Balaam had an interesting financial offer, and he caved in and said, yeah, well, for $1 or $2, or a lot of dollars, yeah, maybe I'll go and see if I can curse Israel. So he climbs on his donkey, and he heads off to a king by the name of Balak, who's a king of Moab, and he says, let's see what we can do. And on the way, you remember that his donkey acts up and keeps bumping against the canyon walls and hurting his leg. And finally, he says, well, you stupid donkey. And the donkey speaks and says, you stupid prophet, okay? And what do you think you're doing? God's already given you directions not to go, and now you're going. And so Balaam then goes ahead anyway. God allows him to go, and he meets with Balak, the king of Moab, who is concerned that Israel is about to enter his land, and he says, I don't want 2 to 3 million Israelites walking on my grass, okay? So they're going to ruin my lawn. And so Balak is upset, and he calls Balaam, and here in chapter 23, we see the first of 5 oracles that occur in Numbers chapter 23 that really tell us a little bit about also the theme of this book of Numbers. So I want us to begin in verse 1, and it says, Balaam said, and he's talking to Balak, Balaam said, build me 7 altars here and prepare 7 bulls and 7 rams for me. Balak did as Balaam said, and the 2 of them offered a bull and a ram on each altar. Then Balaam said to Balak, stay here beside your offering while I go aside. Perhaps the Lord will come to meet with me. Whatever he reveals to me, I will tell you. Then he went off to a barren height. God met with him, and Balaam said, I have prepared 7 altars, and on each altar I have offered a bull and a ram. God was supposed to be impressed with that, okay? The Lord put a message in Balaam's mouth and said, go back to Balak and give him this message. So he went back to him and found him standing beside his offering with all the princes of Moab. Then Balaam uttered his oracle. Balak brought me from Aram, the king of Moab, from the eastern mountains. Come, he said, curse Jacob for me. Come, denounce Israel. How can I curse those whom God has not cursed? How can I denounce those whom the Lord has not denounced? From the rocky peaks I see them. From the heights I view them. I see a people who live apart and do not consider themselves one of the nations, who can count the dust of Jacob or number the 4th part of Israel. Let me die the death of the righteous, and may my end be like theirs. Balak said to Balaam, what have you done to me? I brought you to curse my enemies, but you have done nothing but bless them. He answered, must I not speak what the Lord puts in my mouth? And may God add his blessing to the reading of his holy word. Now, when we come to the book of Numbers, scholars have kind of puzzled over this book for a long time, because when you look at the book of Numbers, it seems like random events, random laws, random recordings of this or that are there, and people say, what in the world is this book talking about? And some scholars have kind of given up and said, well, it's just kind of a glorified travel diary, that's saying, well, these are some things that didn't get written down anywhere else, so let's write them down in Numbers. But I believe there's a clear theme to the book of Numbers that we can understand if we examine it carefully. Now, the book of Numbers is a little bit like Leviticus. Sometimes you start on it and it's like, whew, you start coughing dust, and it begins really with a census. Now, nothing more exciting than a census, okay? There's 47,320 Reubenites, and then there's 58,620 of the tribe of Judah, and it goes on, and you go, but those numbers are important to the message of what Numbers what God is saying through this book. Now, the theme that we find here in the book of Numbers is simply a theme of trust. In Genesis, God had given a promise to Abraham. You remember we looked at that in Genesis 12. And that promise was also not only to Abraham, but it was also to his offspring. But here in Numbers, we find a people who knew of that promise, and yet they lacked the faith and trust to actually possess the promise that was given to them. Now, when we talk about trust can be difficult at times. If you go back and look at the Linus and Peanuts cartoons, you remember, Lucy is about to kick the football, and or Charlie Brown is about to kick the football, and Lucy keeps pulling it away, and Charlie Brown ends up on his back. And so it begins to undermine trust. Well, Israel didn't have any trust to begin with, and trusting can be difficult. But trust is an important aspect of faith if we are to live as Christians in a way that honors and pleases God. And so many times in life, we think we know better than God and that we need to inform him of how he ought to do things. Because obviously, we can't trust him. He only goes by the name of God. How in the world could we depend upon him to get things right? So we may not fully understand what God is doing. And when we don't understand, at times we fall into the habit of complaining over everything, and then we do the wrong thing because of our lack of trust. Now, that's what we see happening in the book of Numbers. Because of their refusal to trust, they seem to struggle for most of their 40 years in the wilderness. This morning in Sunday school, we were looking at Acts chapter 13 and verse 18, and we noticed that Paul, when he was preaching, at one point said to, in a Jewish synagogue, he said to the people gathered there, he said, God endured you in the wilderness for 40 years. And so at times God just endures us, okay? But as they came to the edge of the promised land, they had been prepared, they were organized, they were ready to enter the land, but they refused to believe the promise. So in the first 10 chapters, we see then that the promise was offered to them. They said, here it is. In the next chapters of Numbers, we see that the promise was rejected. And then at the end of Numbers, the last 10 or 11 chapters, we see the promise was finally received. But you see that pattern that may even speak to our own lives as well. But in Numbers chapter 10 and in verse 29, one of the things we see there is that the promise was offered. It says, now Moses said to Hobab, son of Reuel the Midianite, Moses' father-in-law, we are setting out for the place about which the Lord said, I will give it to you. Come with us, and we will treat you well, for the Lord has promised good things to Israel. So right there is the promise that they knew about. So we can't say that they weren't aware of the promise that had been given to them. But even in our own lives, we can ignore the promise and miss out on the blessings that God has set right in front of us. By our lack of faith, we fail to trust that God may be doing something more than we are able to see from our own limited perspective. When we come to this fourth book of the law, we find Israel sadly lacking the faith to actually trust the promise and act upon it. We find them in this book constantly murmuring against God for 40 long years instead of actually believing him. And needless to say, God is not pleased. In Hebrews 11:6, we read, "And without faith it is impossible to please God." Without faith, then, we tend to fall into a restless fussing, and it's kind of like a spoiled, tired child or children who don't know why they are miserable. They just know they're miserable. And you've probably had some trips like that, okay, where you've got that child, and every family has a few horror stories of long trips and fussy kids. As a parent, you know that they just need to take a nap and rest. But they refuse to believe that you know what is best for them. And they continue to fuss mile after endless mile. And it's like, when will this trip be over, okay? Now, Israel had been called by God to enter into covenant with him, but they were having trouble really trusting him. They preferred fussing over trusting, much like those kids in the back seat of the car, okay? And as we read the book of Numbers, we find Israel complaining about the difficulties of their journey. So in this middle section of Numbers, we might call it the Numbers Complaint Department, okay? Because that's what goes on here from about chapter 11 to about chapter 21, 22, that you see this complaint department. In Numbers chapter 11 and verse 1, it says that the first thing, they complained about the difficulties of their journey. Now the people complained about the hardships in the hearing of the Lord, and when he heard them, his anger was aroused. The fire from the Lord burned among them and consumed some of the outskirts of the camp. But their first response was, "This is hard. This is really, really hard." Okay, so this was their magnificent faith as the people of God, okay? Now, they also complained about meat. In verse 4 of Numbers 11, it says, "The rabble with them began to crave other food. And again, the Israelites started wailing and said, 'If only we had meat to eat. Just give me a hamburger. I'm really hungry. Give me, and so they're complaining again. Now, later on, it says they whined about giants in the land. If you go to Numbers 13 and verse 31, "But the men who had gone up with him," and this is after Israel, the spies went into the land, and their response was, "We can't attack those people. They're stronger than we are." Now, again, remember, and we talked about this in Sunday school as well, this was 2 months after. They had just walked through the Red Sea. God had opened the door for them, opened the sea wide open, and said, "Now walk through it." And they said, "We can't go into this land. They're too big for us." And if God is big enough to open the Red Sea, he's probably big enough to handle those giants in the land. So in chapter 14 and verse 3, it says, "Why is the Lord bringing us to this land only to let us fall by the sword? Our wives and children will be taken as plunder. Wouldn't it be better for us to go back to Egypt?" So you see how it's taking over. It's overwhelming the faith of the people of God. They complained about their leaders. In Numbers 16 and verses 1 and 3, it says, "Korah, son of Izhar, the son of Kohath, the son of Levi, and certain Reubenites, Dathan and Abiram, son of Eliab, and On, the son of Peleth, became insolent." And then in verse 3, it says, "They came as a group to oppose Moses and Aaron and said to them, 'You have gone too far. The whole community is holy, every one of them, and the Lord is with them. Why then do you set yourselves above the Lord's assembly?'" And so there was complaining about the leadership. When God ended this rebellion by opening up the ground and swallowing up the sons of Korah and Dathan and Abiram, Then it says they complained that, well, God, that was really too harsh. You shouldn't have done that. So in Numbers 16 and verse 41, it says, the next day the whole Israelite community grumbled against Moses and Aaron. And it says, you've killed the Lord's people, they said. So they're critical of God himself. Although God had provided water throughout their journey repeatedly for 40 years, they came to Kadesh near the end of their time, and they complained about the water. In Numbers chapter 20 and verse 2, it says, now there was no water for the community, and the people gathered in opposition to Moses and Aaron. Do you see the good time they're having? They are really enjoying the trip, okay? It's no wonder the New Testament says God endured them for 40 years, okay? It says they also complained about the manna God had provided for them. In Numbers 21 and verse 5, it says they spoke against God and against Moses and said, why have you brought us out of Egypt to die in the wilderness? There's no bread and there's no water, and we detest this miserable food. Now, God had provided them bread from heaven. He sent down bread from heaven, and still they complained. Their long journey would have been so much more enjoyable if they had just learned to trust the promise. And that's what they refused to do. So here's the theme of the book of Numbers. You ready? 4 words. Don't fuss, just trust. Okay, thank you. Let's go home, okay? No, but that's basically the theme of Numbers. Though God may give his promise, it's still up to his people to trust in that promise. Though we may not see all that God is doing, we need to trust that he is accomplishing his will. Now, that's the same advice that Paul gives to Christians in Romans 8:18. When Paul writes to them, and he says, I consider that our present sufferings are not worth comparing with the glory that will be revealed in us. And so Paul says to the Christians in Rome, God's doing something. Yeah, we're suffering, but hey, there's something good beyond this. In Romans 8:28, Paul reminds us as Christians that God is acting on our behalf, even if we can't understand all that he is doing. And there Paul writes, and we know that in all things God works for the good of those who love him. You see how he's saying, just trust. Those who have been called according to his purpose. So if you're the people of God, well, why don't you trust God? Like Israel, we have been called into covenant with God, but it is still up to us to trust his promise. Unless we learn to trust, we can fall into the same habit of complaining and never enjoy the rest that God wants us to possess in our own lives as his covenant people. And we miss out because we fuss through life instead of trust through life. In Proverbs 3 in verses 5 and 6, Solomon writes, trust in the Lord with all your heart, and lean not on your own understanding. In all your ways acknowledge him, and he will make your paths straight. Now, because Israel didn't trust, their paths weren't very straight. Okay? They came to the edge of the promised land. They said, we can't do it. And God said, okay, then in that case, go walk around the wilderness for the next 38 years. Enjoy yourself for the next 38 years. And so they proceeded to wander and fuss for 38 years. Now, but God didn't make their paths straight because of their lack of faith and trust. With all of Israel's complaining, their journey in the wilderness was a long, twisted, convoluted path rather than a straight path that led them directly into the land of promise. They could have been in the land of promise within 2 months after they left the Red Sea. But because of a lack of trust, they wasted 38 years. So unless we actually trust in the promise that God has given to us, we will be just as miserable and confused as this first generation that left Egypt. The old hymn says it this way: trust and obey, for there's no other way to be happy in Jesus, but to trust and obey. Should have had that hymn written, several centuries earlier, okay, so they could sing it in the wilderness. When we fail to trust the promise, we miss out on the joy of this journey of faith. We drain our joy from ourselves, from others. They drained the joy from Moses. At one point, Moses said, "Lord, why did you give me the burden of 3 million people to deal with?" And Moses was not terribly joyful about that himself. And so without trust, we drain the joy from life. Now, it's interesting that after all of their 40 years of complaining, that God then uses a pagan prophet, maybe more of a sorcerer in a sense, by the name of Balaam, to tell them God always wanted to bless you. He's always wanted that. Now, you know what? I think that was an important message for the second generation to hear. Okay? Because all the first generation died in the wilderness. But I think the second generation probably went back to this passage in Numbers and said, man, we should have trusted from the very beginning. And Balaam tells them that God has always wanted to bless them and that their fussing really accomplished nothing. But it took a pagan prophet to tell the people of God that truth. Balaam was not an Israelite, but we have archaeological records that tell of a well-known diviner by this name, Balaam, who was from northern Syria, who for a price would seek the will of the gods to bless or to curse. And that's exactly what's going on in Numbers. But we have evidence of this man, Balaam, from historical and archaeological records. And in this case then, a Moabite king, Balak, had called upon Balaam for his service and had promised to pay Balaam a handsome fee to travel 400 miles to the area on the northeast edge of the Dead Sea to call down a curse upon the people of Israel. He said, I'll pay you good money. If you can get a curse on the people of God, it's worth every penny. Now, it says Balak then, the king of Moab, had built 7 altars and offered a bull and a ram on each of them. That's pretty impressive. Those are expensive animals, okay? But Balak believed that the gods would certainly be impressed with his offering and give him what he desired. And Balaam, though he said that he could only speak whatever God told him, Balaam still was looking at those dollar signs. And so he attempted to manipulate God to curse Israel. And one of the things that he does in this text, he goes before God and he says, whew, did you see the offering we just made to you? 7 bulls, 7 rams, 7 altars. We deserve something for this, okay? And Balaam was trying to manipulate God, informing him of the great sacrifice that had been offered. And when Balaam returned from this time with God, Balak and all the princes of Moab were gathered expectantly, hoping to hear Balaam announce a great curse upon the people of God. But instead, God blessed them as Balaam uttered his first of 5 oracles. And Balaam, speaking for the Lord, said, how can I curse those whom God has not cursed? How can I denounce those whom God has not denounced? He says, I can't curse them. God has blessed them. Now, we may not see the significance of all of this, but if we remember that the promise that God had given centuries earlier to Abraham, those words sound a little bit familiar. Okay, in Genesis chapter 12 and verse 3, there, the Lord says to Abraham, I will make you into a great nation, and I will bless you. I will make your name great, and you will be a blessing. In verse 3, I will bless those who bless you, and whoever curses you, I will curse. And all the peoples on earth will be blessed through you. Now, do you really think Balaam was going to change God's mind? Because God had made a promise to Abraham centuries before. God had already promised all of this, and all Israel needed to do was just to trust in the original promise given to Abraham, which is what they weren't doing. While Israel was so busy complaining, God was acting on their behalf to fulfill his promise. They just didn't know it. In fact, there was nothing that Balaam could do to change God's original promise, and Balaam learned what Israel should have known all along, that God always keeps his promises. In Numbers chapter 24 and verse 9, in Balaam's third oracle, he echoed the very words that God had originally spoken to Abraham when he said, "May those who bless you be blessed, and those who curse you be cursed." He's just speaking what God had said originally. In Balaam's fourth oracle, we see this same idea. Though the people of Moab tried to curse Israel, they ended up being cursed. Now in Numbers chapter 24 and verse 17, it says, "I see him, but not now. I behold him, but not near. A star will come out of Jacob." Now, I think that's a prophecy of Christ. It's also a prophecy of David. A star will come out of Jacob. A scepter will rise out of Israel, that there will be a ruler who comes to Israel. And God gave this information to Balaam, a pagan prophet. And he says, he will crush the foreheads of Moab, the skulls of all the people of Shechem. Wait a minute. He will crush the foreheads of Moab. Wait a minute. We're the ones supposed to do the cursing here. And God says, Moab will be cursed. Now that's exactly what God promised to Abraham centuries earlier. Later, we see that Balaam himself suffered a judgment from God. First of all, he didn't get a paycheck for his services. In Numbers 24, verses 10 and 11, then Balak's anger burned against Balaam. Oh, king of Moab was angry. He struck his hands together and said to him, "I summoned you to curse my enemies, but you have blessed them these 3 times. In verse 11, he says, "Now leave at once and go home. I said I would reward you handsomely, but the Lord has kept you from being rewarded. So no paycheck for you, Balaam. Get out of my sight. You didn't do what I wanted you to do." Now, the second thing that we see here is that Balaam died by the end of the book of Numbers. In Numbers 31 and verses 7 and 8, it says, "They fought against Midian," and included the people of Moab, "as the Lord commanded Moses, and killed every man." And in verse 8, among their victims were Evi, Rechem, Zur, Hur, and Reba, the 5 kings of Midian. They also killed Balaam, son of Beor, with the sword. So this prophet who thought he could bring a curse upon God's people and bring about death ends up dying by the end of this book of Numbers. So it's evident then that God is absolutely faithful to his promise. And instead of complaining and fighting every step along the way, it would have been so much easier for the people of God just to trust that he had it all under control. But there is one more thing we see here. Though Balaam failed to bring a curse upon Israel, God's people managed to curse themselves by their own disobedience and faithlessness to God. So in our own lives, even though God has promised, we can miss out on the benefits and blessings of that promise if we ignore it and continue in our sin. Although God was absolutely faithful to his promise, Israel missed out on the benefits of all that was promised to them. Now in chapter 25 of Numbers, it says the women of Moab drew the men of Israel into the sexual immorality that was a part of their pagan worship of Baal. Okay, now this is the first time we come to Baal in the scriptures. But we'll see Baal throughout the Old Testament coming back, like a bad nickel or something. But they're involved then in this worship of Baal, and the sexual immorality is a part of that worship. And the curse then that Balaam failed to bring upon Israel, they end up doing to themselves by their own sin. In Numbers chapter 25, 1 through 3, it says, "When Israel was staying in Shittim, the men began to indulge in sexual immorality with Moabite women." It says, "Who invited them to the sacrifice to their gods. The people ate the sacrificial meal and bowed down before these gods. In verse 3, so Israel yoked themselves to the Baal of Peor, and the Lord's anger burned against them. They brought the curse on themselves. They did what God refused to do. Because of this blatant sin, it says that God brought a plague that killed 24,000 of the Israelites. Now, that was the last of the generation that left Egypt. This was the end of the first generation of those people who refused to trust the promise. And it ended any possibility of their entrance into the land that God had promised to his people. Even though God promised it, they didn't have the faith and trust to possess that promise. So simply because Israel failed to trust in the promise of God, they missed out on the blessings of that promise that would now only come to the next generation. And that's the third part of Numbers, is the blessing is received by this next generation. And so you find another census in about chapter 26 of Numbers. That's the census of the second generation. The first generation died out because of unbelief. After all of the death and judgment that occur in the first 25 chapters of Numbers, there is not a single case of grumbling or death that occurs in the last 11 chapters of this book. Though the first generation refused to trust the promise, the next generation was willing to trust in all that God had spoken, and they were willing to enter the land that God had originally promised to them, which they should have done 38 years before. Though Israel was faithless, God was faithful. And even today, he is still faithful to keep his promises. The sooner we learn that lesson, the sooner we will discover joy in the life he has given to us. In 2 Timothy chapter 2 and verse 13, it says, if we are faithless, that was the first generation, he remains faithful because his promise was still intact. It says, for he cannot disown himself. He will keep his promise, and he did. Now that's the message of the book of Numbers. And the events of this book later served as a warning in the New Testament to the Jewish people who were hesitant to trust in another of God's promises, which is really all wrapped up in the one promise, concerning Christ as their Messiah. And in Hebrews 3, we find the writer of Hebrews referring to the events in Numbers when he says, so as the Holy Spirit says, today, if you hear his voice, do not harden your hearts, as you, the Jewish people, did in the rebellion during the time of testing in the wilderness. He's referring back to these events where your ancestors tested and tried me, though for 40 years they saw what I did. He says, that is why I was angry with that generation. I said, their hearts are always going astray, and they have not known my ways. So I declared on oath in my anger, they shall never enter my rest. And that's what God said to that first generation. He said, they will never enter my rest. See to it, brothers and sisters, that none of you has a sinful, unbelieving heart that turns away from the living God. In verse 15, he says, as has just been said, today, if you hear his voice, do not harden your hearts as you did in the rebellion. You hear this invitation to the Jewish people. He says, enter in to the promise that is before you right now. The Messiah has come. And if you reject the fulfillment of the promise of the Messiah, Jesus Christ, you will wander in the wilderness for the rest of your life. In Hebrews chapter 4, in verses 1 and 2, it says, therefore, since the promise of entering his rest still stands, let us be careful that none of you be found to have fallen short of it. And in verse 2, for we also have had the good news proclaimed to us just as they did. But the message they heard was of no value to them because they did not share the faith of those who obeyed. You see the whole importance of faith in trusting the promise. The writer of Hebrews is saying to Israel, here is a second opportunity to trust the promise. And he says, don't miss it again. In Hebrews chapter 4 and verse 7, I didn't underline that. Let me look at Hebrews 4 and verse 7. So Corey's up there going, no, yeah, you're right, Corey. I didn't highlight it. So, but in Hebrews chapter 4 and verse 7, there that we see, therefore God again set a certain day, calling it today. When a long time later he spoke through David, as was said before, today, if you hear his voice, do not harden your hearts. God was giving the people of Israel a second chance to respond to their Messiah. Now, let me say to those of you gathered here today, the promises of God mean nothing if we fail to trust in those promises. Those promises are of no benefit to us if we ignore them or fail to trust in them. Christ died for sinners, but unless you trust in the reality of that saving grace offered to you at the cross of Calvary, his death means nothing. And like Israel in the wilderness, you will die without hope simply because you have refused to believe the good news that has been announced to you. Jesus has promised that whoever comes to me, I will never drive away. That's his promise. But you have to come. In Matthew 11:28, Jesus says, come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest. That's the same rest that the first generation of Israel rejected in the wilderness. And that is God's promise. But without trust, you will never enter the rest that he has promised to you. Come to him today. He has promised you grace, but that grace is only received through faith. Make today the day that you trust in his promises.